I'm Krista Brady, and today I'll be talking to you about the appendicular skeleton. So first, let's define what the appendicular skeleton is. In a previous video, I told you that the axial skeleton is along the long axis of the body, so the rest of the skeleton is considered the appendicular skeleton, and that consists of your appendages, your upper extremities, and your lower extremities. So we're going to start off today by going over the bones of the upper extremity. The first two bones we're going to talk about are the bones that make up the pectoral girdle, which is actually going to hold the upper extremity in place. So these two bones are the clavicle and the scapula. The clavicle, this is what you might commonly call your collarbone, and there's two things that you need to know about the clavicle. Those are these two ends and which is which, okay? So this end right here, notice how bulky and square that edge is. This is actually the end that articulates with the sternum, the breastbone. And that's actually not a great fit. So I'll show you that in 1 minute. On the other end, we have this thinner and wider, flatter end. This is the acromial end of the clavicle, and that's going to articulate with the acromion of the scapula. So with the clavicle, I mentioned that the sternal end of the clavicle is that big, bulky end, and it really doesn't articulate very smoothly with the sternum, so you can actually feel that on yourself. If you put your finger right about here, feel that big, bony projection? That's actually the sternal end of the clavicle poking out right there. So now let's talk about the scapula itself. Okay, so the scapula is this kind of triangle-shaped bone, and it has many things that you need to know about it. So let me go over a few things, and then we'll talk about how you can tell if the scapula is right or left, because that's another thing that I could potentially ask you. So first of all, you'll notice these big projections on the top here. The bigger one right here, this is the acromion, or the acromial process. The smaller one right here is the coracoid process. The coracoid process, that has a C in it, so don't get that mixed up with coronoid like we have on some other bones. Another thing you'll notice on this side is this depression or indentation here. This is called the glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa. You can use either term. And that's where the humerus, which is the large bone of your arm, is going to articulate right there. So that has to be on the lateral side of the bone in order to meet the humerus. Okay, so that gives you one thing to tell lateral from medial. All right, so now I'm going to turn this bone around. So you're now looking at the posterior side of the scapula. And notice this big crest that's coming along here. This is called the scapular spine, the scapular spine. And that's going to come up and then merge into the acromial process up here. In between, or right up here above the scapular spine, is this big depression. So remember that the general term for a depression in a bone is fossa. And this is above the spine, so this is called the supraspinous fossa. Supra means superior, or is referring to superior, so this is superior to the spine. Okay, so if there's a supraspinous fossa, then look at this depression underneath that scapular spine. This one is called the infraspinous fossa because it is inferior to that scapular spine. And if I flip the scapula around, so you're looking now at the anterior side of the scapula, there's one more big shallow depression here. This is called the subscapular fossa, the subscapular fossa. Okay, so another thing you'll notice is that we've got these triangular edges of the scapula, right? So these edges actually have names too. They're called the medial border, because that's on the medial side of the scapula, the lateral border on its lateral side, and the superior border up here. Okay, so now that you know all of the different markings of the scapula, Now you can tell superior from inferior because the acromial process is superior, and this point at the bottom of the scapula, where it comes to an angle there, that's the inferior part of the scapula. And we talked about how the glenoid cavity is on the lateral side of the scapula. And then how do you tell anterior from posterior? Well, a great way is this nice big scapular spine. That is on the posterior side of the scapula. So that will help you tell posterior from anterior. Next, let's talk about the humerus. The humerus is the large bone of your arm. So it will go right like that. It articulates with the scapula on top, and then it's going to articulate with two other bones, the radius and the ulna at the bottom. A few things that you need to know about the humerus. First of all, you've got this large round part at the top. This is called the head of the humerus. And so that part, this big round area right here is going to articulate with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. And then notice these big bumps that you have on off to the side of the head. Okay, so you've got this larger one right here. This is the greater tubercle of the humerus, the greater tubercle. And then the smaller bump right here is the lesser tubercle of the humerus. Right in between them, there is this groove right here, this narrow indentation. And that is called the intertubercular sulcus. So inter means between, it's right in between the two tubercles, hence that name, intertubercular sulcus. You can also call it the bicipital groove, if you like that term better. Moving right down the humerus, down at the bottom here, we have several different markings that you should know. One of them is this round shape right here it's round like a head. This is the capitulum. And then this one right next to it that looks kind of like a pulley is called the trochlea. Trochlea actually means pulley. So these two large processes, the capitulum and this trochlea, these are going to articulate with the radius and the ulna. So flipping that humerus around to the posterior side, notice this large indentation right here. This large indentation is called the olecranon fossa, and that's where the olecranon process of the ulna is going to fit right into that indentation there. So I'll show you that when we talk about the ulna. Now, a couple other things I want to point out on the humerus. One is, as you go down the humerus, kind of on the anterior lateral side, you'll come to this big roughened spot, about a third or slightly more than a third of the way down the humerus. This is called the deltoid tuberosity. The deltoid tuberosity, and this is actually where one of the attachment points of the deltoid muscle will be. And bones often have those roughened areas in places where muscles attach to them because those attachments encourage bone growth in that area. All right, and then down here at the bottom, you'll notice these little ski slopes that are leading off to the edges on each side of the humerus. So this one right here, this is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. And I know it's the medial epicondyle because it's on the same side as the head of the humerus that articulates with the scapula. So if that's the medial epicondyle, then this one on the other side would have to be the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. And you do have to say of the humerus for those because there are epicondyles of other bones as well. So now we've talked about everything to do with the humerus. One thing I just want to point out now is how are you going to tell those three different directions that we always talk about? Posterior from anterior, medial from lateral, and superior from inferior. Okay, well, one really nice marking is the head of the humerus because you know that articulates with the scapula. So that has to be at the superior end of the humerus, and it also has to be medial so that it can meet up with the scapula. All right, so that already tells us superior from inferior. and medial from lateral. Now, how do we tell anterior from posterior? For that, you can use a couple of different markings. The one that I like to use is this nice big olecranon fossa, that big huge indentation that is on the posterior side of the humerus. And that, again, that's where the olecranon process of the ulna is going to fit into. And I'll point out the olecranon process in one moment, but it makes up the nice big bony part of your elbow back here. So that is on the posterior side of your elbow there. Now let's talk about the radius. The radius is a bone of your forearm that's going to be on the thumb side. So it is on the lateral side of your forearm. A couple of things that you should know about the radius. The first is the head of the radius. That's this big round part up here, and that is going to be on the superior side of the radius where it articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Now down at the bottom, you'll notice this nice pointy projection here. This is the styloid process of the radius. And you probably remember the styloid process of the temporal bone, right? So there are multiple styloid processes, so you do have to specify which bone it's part of. Okay, we do have another marking down here on the inferior side of the bone, and that is this little indentation right here. This is called the ulnar notch of the radius, and that's where the radius is going to articulate at the inferior side with the ulna. One other thing that I'll point out is back up here towards the top, towards the superior part, is this big part where the radius pokes out, this big rough area. That is the radial tuberosity, And I am not going to ask you right versus left for the radius because of the way that the images look. It will be a little difficult for you to tell that, but I could ask you right versus left on the ulna. So this is the ulna. This bone is going to be on the medial side of your forearm. It goes to the pinky side. And one of the first things you'll notice probably is this big projection at the top. This is the olecranon process. And so that is that big bulky part of your elbow back here that when you hit it, it really hurts. So that's your funny bone, shall we say, or the nerves in that area are going to cause that sensation. And then you'll notice this big indentation right here. This is the trochlear notch. The trochlear notch, it's also sometimes called the semilunar notch, and that's going to articulate with the trochlea of the humerus. And that trochlea acts like a pulley, so the olecranon, or the ulna, is going to move around that trochlea. And then this projection down here, where the bottom of that trochlear notch comes out to this point, this is called the coronoid process of the ulna. So it is pointy like a crown. So that's why it's called the coronoid process. Okay, moving down to the bottom, we have another pointy part down at the bottom here of this bone, and this is the styloid process of the ulna. So there's another instance of a styloid process. So you do, again, have to specify which bone it's part of. And then one other thing you should know about the ulna is actually back up here on the superior part of the ulna. It's this indentation right here on the, this is going to be on the lateral side of the ulna, and that is the radial notch of the ulna. It's a smooth area where it's going to articulate with the head of the radius. So how are you going to tell if this is a right or a left ulna? Well, we already know superior from inferior, right? That big olecranon process, that's on the superior side. We can also tell anterior from posterior, also using that olecranon process, because that big bony part is the posterior side of your elbow. So that has to be going towards the posterior. So now we just need something to tell us medial versus lateral. There are a couple things you can use for that. One is that radial notch of the ulna, if you can see that, because that has to be on the lateral side so that the ulna can articulate with the radius. But the other thing that might be a little easier is down here, the styloid process of the radius. That is going to be more on the medial side. It's pointing towards your pinky, pointing towards your smallest digit. So now that I know those things, I can wear this bone, and this is in fact a left ulna. Now let's talk about the bones of the wrist. These bones are collectively called the carpal bones, and each has a specific name. This first one here that looks like a boat, it's kind of curved, this is called scaphoid. Scaphoid apparently means boat. Moving along to the medial side, the next one is called lunate, and then we have triquetrum, and then this tiny little pea-shaped bone is called pisiform. Pisiform means pea-shaped. And my friend Sid, another anatomy and physiology instructor at Pima, taught me a little ditty to remember these first 4 carpal bones. It's scan, look, try, pies. Okay, so now we know those first 4. So now let's move to the next row. I'm going to go back to the lateral side here and start with trapezium. And then the next is trapezoid. And then we come to this head-shaped bone right here, which is capitate. Capit is the Latin word for head. So that's why this one is called capitate. And then finally, the last one is called hamate, and hamate has a hook on it. So I'll turn this to the side so that you can see that little hook coming up from hamate. Now, one pair that students often mix up is trapezium and trapezoid. One trick you can use is that they're in alphabetical order. Trapezium is first. That one has an I after the Z. And then trapezoid, which has an O after the Z, comes next. So those are the carpal bones. And then next, let's look at the bones of your palm right here. So the bones of the palm are all called the metacarpals, and they're just numbered based on which digit they're associated with. So we start with the biggest digit. Your thumb, which is also called pollex, is the first digit. And so this bone right here would be metacarpal 1. And then you also, with the metacarpals, want to include whether it's right or left. So this one, this is a right hand. And you can tell that because of the angle of the bones. This hamate, the hook on hamate, is coming towards the anterior side. Okay, so this is the right metacarpal 1. The next one would be the right metacarpal 2, and the right metacarpal 3, 4, and 5. And by convention, we typically use Roman numerals with those metacarpals. Now let's talk about the bones of the digits. These bones are all called phalanges. Phalanges is the plural, the singular is phalanx. With the phalanges, there are several things that you have to include for each bone in order to distinguish which particular one it is. So I'm going to show you on a whiteboard a way that you can keep these elements in order. Most of the digits have 3 phalanges. So the first thing you're going to have to indicate is whether that phalanx is the proximal, middle, or distal phalanx. So proximal, remember that means closer to where the extremity meets the torso. So this would be the first one that you come to along the hand. The next one would be the middle phalanx, and then the farthest one would be the distal phalanx. Okay, so proximal, middle, or distal phalanx of the, and then you have to tell me what digit it's part of. Is it part of the first digit, second digit, third, fourth, or fifth digit? And then you also have to tell me, is it part of the right or left hand? We'll also, by the way, be using these for feet as well. So I'll show you this first with the hand, but in a future video, we'll refer back to this for the feet as well. So let's look at an example. Let's look at this one, this bone right here, this little bone at the end of the third digit. Okay, so this little bone is the farthest one out. So this is going to be the distal phalanx of the, and then we already said that that was the third digit, right? So it's the distal phalanx of the third digit? And then is this the right or left hand? That would be the right hand, right? So now we know that in order to name that particular bone, we would call it the distal phalanx of the third digit of the right hand. Okay, so most of these digits do have 3 phalanges, but notice that the thumb only has 2. So the thumb does not have a middle phalanx. It just has a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx. So today we've gone over the bones of the upper extremity, which are part of the appendicular skeleton. We've talked about the clavicle, the scapula, the humerus, which is the major bone of the arm, the radius and ulna, which are the bones of the forearm, the carpals, the bones of the wrist, the metacarpals, which are the bones of the palm, and the phalanges that make up the digits. Now go ahead and practice these using the labeled and unlabeled images in the Learning Lab PowerPoints, and then you can apply these on the lab exercises.